Well, now the next statement is going to be made by Mr. Geraint, Webb, King's Counsel, on behalf of Kingspan. And Mr. Webb, when you're ready, we should be pleased to hear you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Istefan, Mr. Akbal, thank you. The Grenfell Tower fire was a tragedy that should never have happened. In its Phase 1 report, the inquiry concluded that the cladding system on Grenfell Tower did not comply with the building regulations and that the PE-ACM manufactured by Arconic was the principal reason for the rapid fire spread. At the end of the Phase 2 hearings, on day 308, you said this, sir, and I quote, "In the course of the hearings, it has become apparent that many mistakes were made, and many witnesses have acknowledged that they or the organisations they represented failed in one way or another to meet the standards to be expected of them. However, in order properly to identify and evaluate the underlying causes of the fire, the panel will have to consider the evidence in detail to determine the extent of which such failures contributed to the disaster. The next stage of this inquiry process must, as you have said, sir, ensure that the true causes of this tragedy are identified. And it's in this context that Kingspan Insulation now invites the inquiry to make the following 5 findings based upon the totality of the evidence submitted during Phase 2. Firstly, not only was the presence of the PE-ACM cladding the principal cause of the fire spread over the tower, as has already been found, but it was the overwhelming cause of the rapid fire spread and of the nature and speed of the fire spread across the tower. When it comes to causative potency, the expert evidence demonstrates in our submission that the presence of the PE-ACM effectively eclipses everything else. Secondly, the expert evidence demonstrates that the type of insulation used behind the PE-ACM cladding was not relevant to the nature and speed of the spread of the fire over the tower. All the types of insulation tested acted in fundamentally the same way, by retaining heat within the system. That was the case for both combustible and non-combustible insulation when tested by Professor Bisbee. Thirdly, large-scale testing has demonstrated that K15 is a safe form of insulation when used in appropriate systems. As the inquiry is aware, K15 of the type installed on the tower has been used in 15 different cladding systems which have successfully met BR135 criteria when tested to BS 8414, the details of which have been disclosed to the inquiry. Fourthly, there is no evidence before the inquiry that any person was adversely affected by any toxic smoke from K15. Professor Purser made very clear, and I quote, "He did not consider phenolic insulation at all," end quote. This was because of the very low percentage of K15 on the tower, but also because of its location on the tower. Fifthly, while there are shortcomings in relation to the testing and certification of K15, for which Kingspan Insulation has sincerely apologised, these had no bearing on the selection of the PE-ACM product, which would have been unsafe in any cladding system and should never have been used on a high-rise building with any form of insulation. Kingspan's insulation's shortcoming, while deeply regrettable, were not in any way a cause of the fire or the nature or speed of the spread of the fire. So these submissions are therefore divided into 4 parts. First, I will set out some fuller submissions on each of those points that I have just briefly outlined. Second, I will explain why there are some limited but important corrections to the Phase 1 report, which we invite the inquiry to make in light of the expert evidence. Third, I will summarise Kingspan Insulation's response to the criticisms which have been made against it. And fourth, I'll make some concluding remarks. So turning to part 1, before going into the detailed submissions, I'd like to summarise the context in which K15 came to be used on Grenfell Tower. As you are aware, Kingspan Insulation was not involved in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower and played no role in either the design or the installation of the cladding system. It provided no specific advice or technical guidance in respect of the suitability of K15 to those responsible for the design or the implementation of the refurbishment. It had no contractual relationship with the council or the TMO or any of the designers or the contractors engaged on the refurbishment. It did not provide any products directly to those involved in the refurbishment. It was not informed that K15 was going to be used on the tower, and it was not aware that K15 had been used on the tower until after the fire. That puts it in a very different context to other manufacturers of products used on the tower. K15 only came to be used on the tower at all because, as you have heard, there was a temporary supply problem with the Celotex PIR insulation, which had been specified for use on the tower. Those responsible for the refurbishment therefore purchased a limited amount of K15 to bridge that supply problem. In total, only about 5% of the insulation purchased for use on the facade of Grenfell Tower was K15. I'll now turn to the first issue which I outlined, namely the fact that the overwhelming cause of the rapid fire spread across the tower was the presence of the PE ACM cladding manufactured by Arconic. At paragraph 4b of its written submissions, Arconic has asserted that the expert evidence given in phase 2 was, and I quote, to the effect that ACM PE panels are not in themselves unsafe. I noted that wasn't repeated in the oral submissions earlier today. And it is, of course, a matter for you, for the inquiry, to consider that submission. But certainly in our submission, that is a misrepresentation of the expert evidence from Professor Bisbee. Professor Bisbee could not, in our submission, have been clearer about the dangers posed by PE ACM. His own testing enabled him to conclude with authority that PE ACM, and I quote, represents extreme fire hazards and is uniquely hazardous, his words, and also, quote, is not a product that should be used ever. It's not clear on what basis Arconic is inviting the panel to conclude that uniquely hazardous or any of those other descriptors should be construed as meaning not unsafe. Professor Bisbee's testing also enabled him to confirm his position on causation, and I quote, it remains my view that, of the products and materials present in the external wall assembly of Grenfell Tower, the Rainabond PE was primarily responsible for the rate and extent of fire spread. Professor Bisbee provided his expert opinion to the inquiry on the dangers of using PE ACM in any cladding system. He explained, and I quote, Regulation B4 of the building regulations requires us to adequately limit the external spread of fire. If you have ACM PE used in anything other than insubstantial quantities, I don't think you can be confident you've done that as a designer. That was day 291, page 38. In other words, Professor Bisbee's assessment following his own testing was that any building with PE ACM cladding will necessarily fail to comply with the building regulations because of its hazards. He made clear that it should not be used. The dangers posed by PE ACM cannot be adequately controlled so as to render it safe. It's now clear that as far back as 2001, the government had commissioned large-scale testing of a PE ACM system combined with mineral fibre insulation. That test, as you know, failed. It is deeply regrettable that no action was taken on behalf of the government in respect of that test failure to investigate further whether PE ACM could ever be used safely. The government has recognised that its testing was not published and should have been. It is submitted that this was an important missed opportunity. Arconic has not disclosed any large-scale testing of any system incorporating its own PE ACM product. In those circumstances, it is not at all clear in my submission how Arconic could ever have considered that its product, in any form, was safe for use on tall residential buildings. Prior to the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, Arconic knew that the cassette version of its PE-ACM cladding only achieved Euroclass E when tested in those smaller scale tests. It therefore knew, or should have known, that its claim of a Euroclass B classification was incorrect, certainly in respect of the cassette version used on Grenfell Tower. It knew or should have known that the product was unsafe and not suitable for use on tall residential buildings. Had Arconic published the fact that PE-ACM cassettes achieved a Euroclass E classification, then in our submission it seems highly unlikely that it would ever have been selected by a competent designer for use in any cladding system for a high-rise residential building. The effect of the inaccurate Euroclass B rating was that Arconic's PE-ACM product could, in theory, be used in a cladding system under the linear route, under the building regulations, if combined with non-combustible insulation. In our submission, it is now clear from the expert evidence that such a system would have been utterly unsafe. The large-scale testing commissioned by the DCLG in 2017 demonstrated that PE-ACM systems failed in under 8 minutes, both when using non-combustible mineral wool and when combined with combustible PIR insulation. The extensive modelling undertaken by Effectis has demonstrated that PE-ACM was so dominant in the fire spread at the tower that there would be no material difference in the rate of that fire spread if combustible PIR insulation had been replaced with non-combustible insulation. And of course, the evidence of Professors Bisbee and Torero in Module 7 is consistent with that research by Effectis and has confirmed the dangers of PE-ACM in combination with any form of insulation. Even if the PE-ACM had genuinely had a Euroclass B classification, it would still not have been permissible to combine that with cladding, that cladding with PIR or phenolic insulation under the linear route to compliance. That is a failing in our submission which rests with those responsible for the design and the construction of the refurbishment. It was a failing which should have been identified by building control, but was not. Moving on to the second issue identified. At paragraph 4b of their written submissions, Arconic has also asserted that the expert evidence was to the effect that PE-ACM is only unsafe if combined with combustible insulation. Again, of course, it is a matter entirely for the inquiry, but again, we submit that that is a misrepresentation of the totality of Professor Bisbee's evidence. His evidence was precisely the opposite. Professor Bisbee concluded that it was the insulating properties of the insulation used and not its combustibility that was relevant to the fire spread caused by PE-ACM. That's paragraph 686 of his work 2 package report, and also day 289 on page 178. He explained this. All of his fire tests showed that similar results were obtained where the PE-ACM was combined with non-combustible mineral fibre insulation or with combustible PIR or phenolic insulation. He explained that his testing showed, and I quote, all cases that involve insulation of the cavity are broadly similar, whether the insulation was combustible or not, and whether foil faces were present or not. He described the total heat release as being broadly similar with each of the types of insulation he tested. That's day 289, page 181. In all cases, the Reynobond PE, and I quote, became fully involved in the fire. His conclusion was that the insulation product did not need to burn in order for an escalation to occur. It was sufficient that the insulation product allowed heat to be retained within the system. Day 289, page 176. In fact, the systems using foil-faced non-combustible mineral fibre actually resulted in the PE-ACM being fully involved in the fire more quickly than those comprising foil-faced combustible insulation. Paragraph 685 of the Work Package 2 report. Professor Bisbee also made clear that his testing had real-world implications, as it showed, and I quote, that even a comparatively small ignition source, such as must be expected in a residential fire scenario, can, under the right circumstances, lead to irreversible and severe escalation of burning and fire spread in or on a ventilated rain screen cladding system incorporating ACM panels with a polyethylene filler stroke core alongside either combustible or non-combustible insulation. Paragraph 702 of his Work Package 2 report. In summary, therefore, Professor Bisbee's evidence could not, in our submission, be clearer. Arconic's PE ACM was unsafe for use with any form of insulation, combustible or non-combustible. His evidence means that Arconic's PE ACM product could never safely be used, and so we should submit should not have been marketed. I know the panel will be astute to ensure that the clear conclusions of the experts are not now misrepresented. Professor Torero agreed with Professor Bisbee's conclusions that it was the ability of the insulation to retain heat within the system, not the combustibility of the insulation, which resulted in PE ACM entering, in his words, a runaway phase of fire propagation. That was day 292, page 97. Insulation is designed to retain heat, and it plays a vital role in this regard from an environmental perspective. The need for insulation in rain screen cladding refurbishments, such as Grenfell Tower, is a regulatory requirement mandated by Part L of the building regulations. Therefore, a cladding product must be designed to be safe for use with insulation. It must be capable of dealing with the heat inevitably retained by the insulation. It's therefore of fundamental importance that the experts have concluded that Arconic's PE ACM product could not be safely used with any form of insulation. In addition, it's important to note that Professor Bisbee's opinion, based on the results of his testing, was, and I quote, "The energy contribution from the insulation products is comparatively quite small if you compare it against something like the polyethylene from ACM once it starts burning." When asked by counsel to the inquiry to quantify the meaning of quite small, he said that it could be between 2 to 10%. That's day 290, page 23. Kingspan Insulation has explained in its written submissions why it considers that Professor Bisbee's 2 to 10% estimate is in fact likely to be an overestimate. But even working with those figures, it's clear that any heat release contribution from K15 would have been negligible, between 0.1 and 0.5% of all energy produced, given that K15 was only 5% of the insulation ordered for use on the tower. In legal terms, in our submission, any energy contribution from K15 would truly have been de minimis. It's also interesting to note that Professor Bisbee's own experiments showed that PE ACM combined with unfaced mineral fibre insulation, i.e. the type available for use in rain screen cladding at the time, reached critical time and time of peak heat release rate marginally more quickly, on average, than when combined with either full-faced PIR or phenolic insulation. Similarly, effectiveness modelling also showed that if PIR had been substituted with non-combustible insulation, the fire propagation would have been marginally quicker. And in addition, the 2017 DCLG test of PE-ACM with mineral fibre again failed marginally more quickly than with PIR. In summary, all of the expert evidence is consistent. The type of insulation made no material difference to the nature and speed of the spread of the fire at the tower. Critically, there is absolutely no expert evidence to support any claim that the nature or the speed of the spread of the Grenfell Tower fire would have been materially different if non-combustible insulation had been used instead of combustible insulation. Moving to the third point. Professor Torero was very careful in his evidence to explain that it is the cladding system as a whole which must be assessed for safety. He explained that systems made of entirely non-combustible materials can be unsafe systems. As I've said, K15 of the type installed on the tower has been used in 15 different cladding systems which have successfully met the BR135 criteria when subjected to a large-scale BS 8414 test. There are other examples of 8414 testing of such systems which Kingspan was not involved in addition. K15 has therefore been demonstrated by those large-scale tests to be a safe form of insulation when used in appropriate systems. As far as Kingspan Insulation is aware, no other rain screen insulation has been used in so many different cladding systems that have successfully met the BR135 performance criteria when tested in large-scale BS8414 tests. Details of each of those 15 large-scale tests have been provided to the inquiry, and counsel to the inquiry stated on day 113 that those large-scale tests would be examined as part of the inquiry process, and no doubt they have been carefully examined. They are valid tests of relevant systems. There is no expert evidence to the contrary. In contrast, it is striking that this inquiry process has not brought to light a single instance of a PE ACM cladding system meeting ABS 8414 test and the BR135 criteria. The evidence obtained by the inquiry shows that whenever a cladding system incorporating PE ACM has been subjected to a large-scale testing, that system has failed. Indeed, Professor Bisbee very memorably threw down the gauntlet on this issue. He said, and I quote, "I defy you to pass a BS 8414 test with PE ACM." That was day 290, page 188. Those are strong words, which in our submission vividly demonstrate Professor Bisbee's opinion that PE ACM cladding can never be safe for use. It's certainly a challenge that Arconic have not been able to meet. They've not pointed to and cannot point to a single successful BS 8414 test of a cladding system using PE ACM with any type of insulation. The fourth issue, the issue of toxic smoke. As I've noted, Professor Purser explained that he intentionally did not consider K15 at all because it was such, and I quote, "a very small percentage of what was on the tower, generally, and in particular because so little of it was used," again I quote, "on the upper levels where most of the burning occurred." That's day 297, page 164. Accordingly, there is no expert evidence that any person suffered any injury as a result of any smoke produced by K15. We also note that Professor Purser stated that there was, I quote, "a lack of any data from further full-scale reconstruction tests or computer fire modelling work, and that this placed, in his words, limitations on the extent to which I'm able to determine in detail the pattern of development of the smoke and the toxic gas conditions within the flats." In fact, however, there has been extensive, independent, peer-reviewed and published CFD modelling carried out by Effectis, which has examined the pattern of development of smoke and toxic gases. Thus, the type of modelling which Professor Purser considered would assist him not only can be undertaken, but has been undertaken. Perhaps most importantly, Professor Purser failed adequately to investigate the toxic effect of fires involving apartment contents. Independent research from Effectis has analysed various spaces within the tower and has shown that for each of those spaces, the fire involving apartment contents are likely to have generated the largest source of toxic gases. Professor Purser's analysis simply did not engage with this major source of toxic gases adequately. For all the reasons that we've set out in our written submission, it's submitted that Professor Purser's evidence does lack the necessary scientific rigour to enable proper conclusions to be drawn from it or any real weight to be placed on it. We've set those points out in some detail in our written submissions. Of course, it's entirely a matter for the inquiry. Moving on to the fifth point, and this is in relation to Kingspan Insulation's shortcoming, but the lack of causative effect of those. Kingspan Insulation has accepted and apologised for the fact that there were shortcomings in relation to the testing and certification of K15 prior to 2015. Mistakes were made which should not have been made. However, none of those shortcomings were causative of the fire or the nature or speed of the spread of the fire in any way. By the time that K15 was purchased for use on the tower, the older BBA and LABC certificates, which were considered in detail during the course of the inquiry, had been revised, and no competent professional in our submission would have been misled in any material way by any of the certification or marketing materials relating to K15 as at the relevant time, namely the time that it was acquired for use on the tower. Unfortunately, however, None of the designers, architects or builders involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment took any adequate steps to ensure compliance with the requirements of the building regulations and approved document B. They were certainly not misled by any of the testing and certification relating to K15. None of Kingspan Installation's shortcomings in any way affected the decisions made by those designers, architects or builders, whether in relation to the use of PE ACM cladding on the tower, or the use of PIR insulation with PE ACM cladding, or the use of the small quantity of K15 used as a substitute for PIR. Furthermore, of course, the expert evidence has now clearly shown, as I've said, that the type of insulation on the tower was irrelevant to the nature and extent of the fire spread. In summary, therefore, whilst the shortcomings acknowledged by Kingspan Installation were wrong and unacceptable, they were not in any way cause of the fire or the nature and speed of the spread of the fire. I now turn to part 2 and the issue of corrections to the Phase 1 report. It's submitted that in light of the expert evidence, there are some limited but important corrections which ought now to be made to the Phase 1 report. That report correctly concluded that the PE ACM cladding was the principal cause of the nature and speed of the Grenfell Tower fire, and was careful to explain that further expert evidence would be needed to ascertain the contribution played by any other materials. However, we have identified 4 passages of the Phase 1 report which could be read as suggesting a preliminary conclusion to the effect that the combustibility of the insulation used on the tower may have contributed to the speed of the spread of the fire on the tower in some way. With the benefit of the totality of the expert evidence, such statements in our submission now should be revisited and corrected because they are not supported by the expert evidence of Professor Bisbee and Professor Torero. None of the expert evidence supports the conclusion the nature or the speed of the spread of the Grenfell Tower fire would have been materially different had non-combustible insulation been used behind the PE ACM cladding. It's respectfully submitted that that now needs to be fully explained. And unless those clarifications are made, in our submission there is a material risk that homeowners, consumers, insurers, and the construction industry may be misled as to the conclusions of the experts instructed by the inquiry. Part 3, and response to the criticisms that have been made of Kingspan Installation and K15. In our submission, these criticisms, particularly insofar as they relate to issues of product safety, now also need to be revisited in the light of the expert evidence of Professors Bisbee and Torero. During the Phase 2 hearings, there was a particular focus on certain BS 8414 tests carried out by Kingspan Installation on systems incorporating K15, and I will address each of those briefly. The 2005 test. Kingspan Installation accepts that following the change from old technology to new technology of K15 in 2006, it should have replaced the 2005 test with a new BS 8414 test using new technology K15. Dr. Malcolm Rochford, former technical director of Kingspan Installation, explained when he gave evidence that the new technology K15 used substantially the same chemistry, and there was no basis for thinking the production changes would make any significant difference in terms of fire performance. There was absolutely no intention to mislead anyone. Moreover, no expert evidence has been adduced to suggest the production changes would have made any difference in terms of fire performance. The short answer to these criticisms, of course, is that there have been a total of 15 other successful BS 8414 tests of systems which incorporated the type of K15 used on the tower. No criticism whatsoever has been made of those tests, and they provide, in our submission, unequivocal evidence that multiple different cladding systems incorporating K15 of the type used on the tower have met the relevant BR135 criteria. Those tests are, of course, available for any fire engineer to rely upon. It's also wrongly been contended that a classification report was required to state that the 2005 test had met the criteria set out in BR135. However, that requirement, the requirement for a classification report, did not come in until 2015. The test data of the 2005 test remained available for analysis, and the BRE was able to issue a positive classification report in 2015 and did so when the requirement for the classification report was introduced. Of course, each of the other 15 BS 8414 tests does have a classification report. The 2007 and 2008 tests of a SOTEC system. In December 2007, a BS 8414 test was carried out in respect of a SOTEC cladding system using new technology K15. It was put to several witnesses that this 2007 test somehow demonstrated that new technology K15 failed, even that it failed spectacularly when tested, and oral submissions have been made to that effect over the last day and a bit. Such assertions are plainly and obviously wrong. The December 2000 test was a test of a system. It was a system which combined SOTEC cladding with K15. That test, very importantly, was repeated a month later, in January 2008, using the same SOTEC cladding system, but this time with non-combustible mineral fibre insulation. That system again failed. Both systems were designed in the same way. No one has suggested that the January 2008 test somehow demonstrates that non-combustible mineral fibre failed spectacularly. It clearly did no such thing. Such a suggestion would be absurd. And yet this is the direct equivalent of the type of allegations that are made in relation to K15 in respect to that 2007 test. And it's quite clear from the evidence of Professors Bisbee and Torero that the assertions put to factual witnesses to the effect that K15 failed that December 2007 test would not be supported by either of them. In fact, it's the January 2008 SOTEC test which is of particular importance for another reason. It is an example of a system incorporating A1 and A2 cladding and insulation, which was compliant under the linear route, but nevertheless failed to meet BR 135 criteria when tested to 8414. It was therefore an example of the important point of public safety which has now been emphasised very clearly by Professor Torero in particular, that systems using only non-combustible and limited combustible materials, Euroclass A1 and A2, can be unsafe systems and can fail 8414 tests if tested. This is an issue which is of direct relevance in our submission to the inquiry's terms of reference in relation to recommendations for the future. The 2014 testing of R&D versions of K15. 2 tests were carried out in March and July 2014 on systems incorporating research and development variants of K15. Kingspan Insulation has accepted that it failed to make clear that those tests were of non-standard K15, and it should have made this clear. The failure properly to explain the R&D aspects of the 2014 tests was not intentional. There was no intention on the part of anyone at Kingspan Insulation to deceive the market in relation to these tests. And once again, any fire engineer wanting to consider the tests relating to K15 as used on the Grenfell Tower are able to consider the full 15 other 8414 tests of cladding systems incorporating this type of K15, as I've said. Class O testing. A lot of time has been spent by the inquiry looking at Class O, or Class 0 as it's also called. Professor Torero has explained that the reference to Class O in approved document B, diagram 40, is in his words wholly inappropriate because Class O testing does not reproduce the system behaviour and, in his words, is not testing the system behaviour. Dr. Lane explained in some detail how the Class O definition changed over time and how ultimately it ended up as a test of the surface when the requirement to test the substrate with the surface was removed from the statutory guidance document in 1985. Kingspan Insulation understood the Class O test in the way that Dr. Lane described its history. It came to be a test of the surface material, i.e., in the case of this product, of the foil. It's correct to say that Professor Bisbee strongly disagreed that the foil should be tested in isolation. But in our submission, the wording of the statutory guidance in this respect is clear, and a manufacturer cannot properly be criticised for testing in accordance with the statutory guidance. But in any event, the classification of Class O for insulation is an irrelevant issue for designers considering the linear route to compliance. It's important to emphasise that, and this is because the linear route requires the insulation to be of limited combustibility. Combustible insulation can therefore never be used under the linear route, regardless of whether it is Class O or not. Certification, marketing, and promotion of K15. Much time was spent during the inquiry looking at historic certificates for K15, but as at the time of supply of K15 for use on Grenfell Tower in 2015, the LABC and BBA certificates had been substantially revised. By the time of supply, the certification, marking and promotional literature concerning K15 was clear in explaining that BS 8414 tests were a test of a specific system. None of the product certification or product literature for K15 current at the time of the refurbishment could possibly have misled any competent professional into thinking otherwise in our submission. Kingspan Installation has accepted that some of the older variations of the LABC and BBA certificates were not always phrased as well as they should have been, and in some aspects of those certificates were capable of being misunderstood. But those certificates, of course, were not produced by Kingspan Installation. The wording of the BBA and LAB certificates was a matter for those independent certifying bodies, and they are responsible for any errors or omissions in their certificates. The BBA's evidence was clear. It acted independently, and it accepted that it is responsible for the wording used in those certificates. There was no dishonesty or fraud or collusion on the part of Kingspan Installation in respect to the K15 certification. But Kingspan Installation recognises that it could and should have done more to draw any issues relating to those certificates to the attention of the issuing bodies, and Kingspan Installation has apologised for omitting to do that. Changes have been made to Kingspan Installation's processes to ensure that such issues are picked up and referred back to certifying bodies. Similarly, Kingspan has accepted that some of the earlier marketing and promotion of K15 prior to 2015, when K15 was purchased for use on the tower, was not sufficiently clear in specifying the limitations of the 2005 BS 8414 test. Again, Kingspan Installation has apologised for those shortcomings. It's clear, however, that no one involved in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment was misled in any way by any of the relevant testing or certification or promotional materials relating to K15. Had any competent person given any proper consideration to the need to comply with the building regulations, then it would have been immediately apparent that combustible insulation could not lawfully be used with PE ACM cladding under the linear route. None of the K15 certificates or marketing materials current at the time of supply stated otherwise, nor represented K15 to be non-combustible or limited combustibility. Ultimately, the design of a particular cladding system is, of course, the responsibility of the designers, the architects, and the cladding contractors engaged on that particular construction. It is the responsibility of the designers to be satisfied with the fire safety of the whole design and to ensure compliance with the building regulations. Tragically, in our submission, that responsibility was simply not discharged by those responsible for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. I now turn to the allegation that Kingspan Installation should somehow be blamed for the use of combustible materials generally. In submissions you heard yesterday morning, it was rightly accepted by Stephanie Barwise, King's Counsel on behalf of BSR Team 1, that K15 installation did not cause the fire spread at Grenfell Tower. However, assertions were still being made yesterday to the effect that Kingspan Installation should somehow be held responsible for the fact that other manufacturers produce and promoted unsafe products. That is not a fair or sustainable allegation in our submission. The seminally causative argument, is how it's been referred to, put forward by certain of the BSRs, ignores the fact that it was the government who amended approved document B to allow the use of combustible insulation in systems subject to large-scale fire tests. It also ignores the fact that it is the responsibility of the designers, not the product manufacturers, to be satisfied with the fire safety of the system and to ensure compliance with the building regulations. And most crucially, it also ignores the expert evidence of Professor Bisbee that has shown that the type of insulation used on the tower was irrelevant to the nature and extent of the fire spread. Simply put, the argument holds no water. Furthermore, it's being alleged that Kingspan Installation's K15 somehow paved the way for PE ACM to follow. If that is the case that is being put, then it is clearly also wrong. The government commissioned its first large-scale test of PE-ACM systems, as we know, as far back as 2001. This was precisely because such cladding was already in existence in 2001. K15 insulation did not come to the market until 4 years later, in 2005. In short, it is quite wrong to suggest that Kingspan insulation should somehow be blamed for the fact that other companies marketed unsafe PE-ACMs, or for the fact that the regulatory system did not prevent the marketing of those unsafe PE-ACM systems. Kingspan insulation is a manufacturer of one specific type of insulation that has been demonstrated to be capable of being safely used in appropriate cladding systems. It is not a proxy for the industry, nor responsible for the actions of others in the industry. Kingspan insulation is not responsible in any way for the actions of Arconic. Corporate culture. Kingspan insulation has disclosed over 23,000 documents to this inquiry in respect of a 20-year period. Virtually every aspect of Kingspan insulation's business over the last 2 decades has been examined in extraordinary detail for disclosure purposes and during the course of this inquiry. That process has unearthed a handful of emails and chats involving a small number of former employees which have revealed conduct which was totally inappropriate and unacceptable, and which has been acknowledged as such, and for which Kingspan insulation has apologised unreservedly. Such improper behaviour has no place in Kingspan insulation or in the wider Kingspan group, and it is no way reflective of its core values. None of those employees remain in the employment of the company. Those isolated communications, however, are the exception, and they should not condemn the behaviour of the many hundreds of employees that work at Kingspan Insulation, let alone the 21,000 employees who work for the Kingspan Group worldwide. Fire safety is at the very heart of Kingspan Insulation's business, and it could not be taken more seriously. To the best of its knowledge, the company has undertaken more 8414 tests of systems incorporating K15 than have been undertaken by any other manufacturer in respect of any other form of rain screen insulation. Kingspan Insulation is absolutely confident as to the safety of K15 when used in appropriate tested cladding systems. And this confidence is justified by the number of successful BS 8414 tests of such cladding systems. Finally, it was repeatedly suggested during questioning of witnesses from Kingspan Insulation that the company somehow acted improperly in 2018 in drawing the Parliamentary Select Committee's attention to the very important fact that just because a system incorporates A1, A2 cladding and insulation does not mean that that is necessarily safe or that it will automatically pass an 8414 test. Kingspan Insulation gave examples of such systems failing when tested. It carried out testing of an A1, A2 system which was properly designed and built and which failed when tested. Allegations were repeated yesterday that Kingspan Insulation was somehow trying to manipulate the government or was not using honest science. Neither allegation is true. Precisely the same points have been emphasised by Professors Bisbee and Torero. Quite correctly, no criticism has been made of them for articulating these concerns. The fact is that this is a vitally important point of public safety, and Kingspan Insulation makes no apology for raising it or illustrating the point by valid and proper testing. Finally, some concluding remarks. In short, we would like to emphasise the following points. First, the overwhelming weight of the evidence is that the nature and speed of the spread of the fire at Grenfell Tower was caused by the presence of the uniquely hazardous PE-ACM panels. The nature and speed of the fire spread would not have been materially different had non-combustible insulation been used in combination with PE-ACM. PE-ACM was unsafe for use in any cladding system with any form of insulation. Second, the numerous successful large-scale BS 8414 tests of systems incorporating K15 demonstrates that K15 is an insulation which can safely be used in appropriate cladding systems. In respect to the Grenfell Tower, fire, there is no evidence that any smoke from K15 caused any injury to any individual. Thirdly, while there were shortcomings in relation to the testing and certification of K15, for which Kingspan Installation has apologised, those shortcomings, as I've said, have no bearing on the selection of the PE core product that was used, which would have been unsafe in any cladding system and should never have been used on a high-rise building with any insulation. None of Kingspan Installation's shortcomings is of any relevance to the issue of causation. Finally, a significant share of the responsibility for the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower rests with Arconic as the manufacturer of the PE ACM material in our submission. In addition, responsibility also rests with those responsible for the design, construction and approval of the refurbishment works. More generally, this inquiry has shown the multiple inadequacies of the regulatory regime which fail to prevent the uniquely hazardous PE ACM cladding from being used and built in cladding systems. Kingspan Installation has provided a written paper in respect of the reforms which it has implemented since 2017, reflecting what the BSR Team 2 called for yesterday as a change of mindset. It has also set out its proposals for recommendations for future reform by way of detailed written submissions. We respectfully invite the inquiry to pay careful attention to those suggestions as it considers how best to ensure that a tragedy like Grenfell Tower never happens again. Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Webb.
Thank you.
Well, that statement brings us to the end of the statements which we are expecting to hear today. So we shall rise in just a moment, but there are more statements to be made tomorrow, and therefore we shall sit again at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning when we shall hear from another one of the core participants. So thank you all very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. Thank you.